Hello and welcome to DCA Committee. Steve, would you mind sitting down, please? I know you're showing off your 1980s races, of course, but try to contain yourself. Can I particularly welcome two people? Firstly, Councillor Halfway. It's great to see you back. I hope you fully recovered and you're well now. Also to my right, with actually Matthew Pippa, who's recently joined our transport team. So it's good to see you here. We'll see you on future occasions. Can I also say I'm particularly relieved Pippa tells me to call her Pippa. And I know with my speaking impediment, I tend to actually try to skirt around Councillor Hume's Christian name. So that's quite merciful, thank you. So we'll move on to apologies and substitutions, but looking around, I don't believe there are any. Are there any declarations of interest? No. We then have the minutes of the last meeting, 16th of March, which have been circulated. I believe they are a true and accurate copy. Can I move those? Do I have? Thank you, Andrew. We'll then move on to the action sheet. Now, the only issue was the enforcement discussion. We had this at DC Leeds last Wednesday, and in summary, it was agreed that as an item, it was more appropriate for it to be investigated by the Growth and Regeneration Scrutiny Commission. So I've spoken to Councillor David Wilcox, who chairs that, and myself and Zoe Wilcox have written to him. So hopefully in June, when they have their meeting, they'll agree that as a work programme item. So in due course, I'm sure members will receive the feedback, but no doubt if the Scrutiny Commission invites comments, I'm sure members may have interest and views. So that was the action sheet. Appeals, Gary.
Thank you, Chair. So reporting on the updated appeals situation for this meeting, the first thing I wanted to bring to your attention were items 28 to 31, which are on page 21 of the papers. And you'll recall that last time we reported belatedly that the enforcement notices had been served with regards to issues around the Y Vale Garden Centre at Bath Road, Brislington. As you can see there, the owners of the site have appealed those enforcement notices, so that will go through the appeal process now. They have been made on the basis of written representations, so hopefully that will lead to a speedier kind of resolution of those issues. So clearly, once we get the decisions back on those, we will report them back to this committee. Then in terms of decisions that we've received, some real headlines here. So starting at the top of page 22, at long last, and I'm sure members will be aware of this already, we received the decisions from the Secretary of State on the proposals at Silverthorne Lane in Temple Quarter. Those applications had been considered by this committee quite some time ago and had resolved to grant permission in line with the officer recommendation. However, due to holding objections from the Environment Agency, the Secretary of State had called it in, and a public inquiry was held last year. And then after a considerable period of time, the planning inspector who had held that inquiry submitted her report to the Secretary of State, and we finally got the decision earlier this month. And whilst it says appeal allowed, it wasn't actually an appeal, it was an application called in by the Secretary of State. And I think, well, the good news is that the Secretary of State has granted planning permission for the development. There's a lot in there, and if members wish, I could send the decision to. It runs to 100 plus pages because it's the Secretary of State decision and then the whole inspector's report. But there's a lot of good stuff in there, really, and it really kind of, points in a positive direction for future development in Temple Quarter, because in particular the Secretary of State endorsed the inspector's approach on flood risk within the area. Officers had felt that whilst there were some flooding issues there that in time will be improved by the River Avon flood strategy, that given the low level of risk of flooding in the early stages of the life of this development, including to a school, that the scheme was acceptable. And it's good to see that the Secretary of State largely endorsed the council's approach to the issue of flood risk and therefore granted planning permission. So a positive outcome on that, and one that we've been waiting for some time. Then it's worth mentioning the next item, item 36, which is the former Police Dog and Horse Training Centre, albeit that was a decision taken by the DCB committee just over a year ago, where in that case, officers have felt that the flood risks were significant and that permission should be refused, but the committee felt that permission should be granted. Again, there was an Environment Agency holding objection, and again, so the application was called in. An inspector held a public inquiry into that scheme as well. And we're in the bizarre situation there where we got the decision through the middle of last month. The inspector, who had considered all the evidence, actually recommended that permission be granted. Actually felt that the level of flood risk again was lower than the Environment Agency considered. However, in that occasion, the Secretary of State felt that the level of flood risk was more significant and that on balance, permission should be refused. So the proposed use of that site by the Caravan Club has been refused by the Secretary of State. And then also on flooding issue, and again a slightly different situation, item 37, which is a site at 10 Feeder Road. This is south of the feeder where, in terms of council officers, we feel that the level of flood risk is more significant than north of the feeder. And therefore, under delegated powers, officers had refused permission for the development of that site for student accommodation. The developers had appealed against that, and again, to our surprise, to be honest with you, the inspector granted permission for the development. It is, however, subject to what's known as a Grampian condition, which is a condition that has to be complied with before development can take place. And that does require some fairly significant flood evacuation arrangements to be put in place before the development can be occupied. But at least, again, it's a positive decision in terms of regeneration of the area, but it has, and it's kind of got a few people thinking about how the scheme can therefore be delivered with those quite complicated arrangements. But overall, it's been a real test of the approach to flooding by both the City Council and the Environment Agency, and a piece of work is being carried out in order to kind of bring forward the lessons learned from these appeal decisions, which we will brief you on in due course. And then the final decision I just wanted to bring to your attention was item 47, which is on page 24. And this is a site at Swift House and Albert Crescent in St Phillips. This was an application considered by the DCA committee in April last year, so pre-election, and it's one where it's for a waste transfer station next to the existing facility on that site, which is the former Gulliver's Truck and Van Hire. Officers had recommended approval. However, members were concerned about the proposals. This is close to the St Phillips nursery, so there were concerns about the impact of the development, particularly on users of that facility. The inspector considered this under written representations and has allowed the appeal. The inspector felt that whilst there were potentially some impacts that under the planning conditions they could be successfully mitigated. The inspector also covered off the public sector equalities duty quite comprehensively within that decision as well. And also, one of the areas for debate at the committee was that some of the really detailed aspects of controlling, in particular, odour at the site would not really fall within the council's remit, would fall within the environmental permitting remit of the Environment Agency, and I remember members being concerned about that, but it's something that the inspector fully considered and did feel that the right method of control of that was through the Environment Agency. So it was one of those things that reinforces the point that we make from time to time, that the council can't control everything about a development. Sometimes we do have to leave it to somebody else, albeit we don't have control over that. So that in that decision, the inspector kind of reinforced that position. So that's my update this time around, Chair. Happy to take any questions.
I've just got one question, Gary, regarding Clannish Road. Whilst I appreciate appeal decisions don't necessarily determine or influence future planning determinations, where are we with the Baltic Wharf application? I believe a few months ago it might have came to committee by February, but it seems to be a bit more further afield now.
Yes, I don't think it's too far away. There's a number of, we've gone through all the issues there. I think we're almost there. Of course, the one issue we're not there on is called flood risk, and the site is particularly challenging with regards to that. So I think as part of the kind of the lessons learned from the variety of flood-related planning appeals that we've had decisions on in the last month, that's certainly a site that will benefit from that learning, and we're not quite there yet. But of course, we've assessed all the issues, but we've got to present them all to the committee, and obviously the committee will have to take its own view on all of those issues, including flood risk.
Other member questions? Paul.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Gary. I was just wondering, I noticed items 52 to 54, that was a delegated decision where there's been an appeal and costs have been awarded. I just wondered if you had anything to add to that.
It's a development that was very controversial locally. It had been granted permission on appeal in itself, and I think on reflection we'd taken a bit of a we probably scrutinised the details too much, really, and perhaps we're trying to challenge the principle of development. So I think in recognition of that, we kind of conceded quite early on, but nonetheless, by making the appeal, the developer had incurred some costs. So that's why I think both the appeals, which are against discharge of conditions, that's why they were allowed, and then the inspector has awarded costs. So we don't think they'll be significant because, one, it was written representations, and also at an early stage, I think we recognised we'd probably gone too far. So, yeah.
John.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I think it was on number 37 you mentioned about the inspector had said with the right flood evacuation plans it could be alleviated. Is that then one of the lessons learned, or is that something that you look at to try and, get these things through, or not? Or yeah,
I think we'd taken an approach on that one where I think the flood evacuation plans were so complicated and required other land that we thought there was no prospect of those evacuation plans coming forward. Now, there's case law that does contradict each other on the use of Grampian conditions as to whether you can say before a development is either commenced or, in this case, occupied, an evacuation route, a high-level route, should be in place. We thought it was just too unlikely, but the inspector felt that it was more likely than we thought, but also that if the developer wants to build the scheme out and can't deliver the evacuation arrangements, then if the buildings are just there empty, that's the developer's problem. Now, I think as a local planning authority, we think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because large unoccupied buildings are not good for the city. So I think we would still probably disagree with the inspector on that, but nonetheless the inspector's granted permission, but it does depend upon high-level escape routes. Now, the council's joint delivery team within Temple Quarter, though, is aware of that, is in discussions with the developer the council owns land next door and wants to bring it forward for development as well. So I think there's probably a sensible way forward there to kind of bring the sites together. So it's, yeah, but it's certainly, the inspector took a surprising approach to flood evacuation that we weren't anticipating, but and yeah, we've got to kind of bear that in mind going forward.
Any other questions? No. Item 7, enforcement. No enforcement notices have been issued, so there's nothing to report. Item 8, public forum. Normally we take any public forum directly before the agenda item, but of course we only have one planning application this evening, so we do that. But bearing in mind of the 5 people who submitted statements, 3 are going to speak. I don't think we need to use the central mic. For the 3 people, if you're all seated in the front row down there, just so you can use the audio mic on your front desk, please straighten it up before you and press the button to the right when I call your name. It should flash up red, so which means it's working. And please turn it off when you actually finish speaking. Members have all received your statements and read them, and the public and press. So if I could ask you to try to summarise your statement in about 1 minute, please. The first statement is from Nikki Featherstone. Nikki?
Hello. Yes, thank you very much, everyone, tonight. So I'm representing Castlemead Insurance Brokers, who are the owner-occupiers of the building. Excuse me. So I guess one of the main things, just in summarising what we've put on our statement, really, is that Castlemead moved from Clifton in 2013 to this site because we had a number of our staff who were struggling to find parking, and as the business has grown, it's become more and more of a problem. So the business has now moved to 20 people. We're trying to recruit more people, and actually the current building that we have doesn't really allow for that. So the building has got lots of small rooms, it's got terrible insulation, and Castlemead are also very proud of their environmental, social and governance programme, which we've just embarked upon. So we're looking to become a net zero business, carbon emission business, and we can't do it physically in the building that we have because of the type of building that it is. We've also, the type of insurance that we do has become a lot more complex and international based, and trying to, I guess our clients expect a bit more of us in the current building that we're in at the moment. The other thing, unfortunately, is that we do have a team member who has MS, and we can't accommodate her within the building. There is no way of putting a lift into the building. It's got very steep steps within the building, so there's no way actually that we can have her working in the building. She's having to work at home. So really, from a business point of view, we're looking to move to newer, better offices, which are more open plan, allow for collaborative working, and a more hybrid type of working. Our members of staff come from all over Bristol and Somerset as well, so we'll probably be looking for somewhere which is easier for people to get to rather than coming into Bristol city centre. And that's it really from our point of view as a business. Like I say, it's about the business's growth and what we're trying to achieve in the future. We don't feel that that building can fulfil that for us.
Thank you. Since unusually I've been quite lenient and allowed you 2 minutes rather than 1, in the interest of fairness, I should extend the right to your 2 colleagues, so feel free to use the 2 minutes. Katie Morant, please.
Hi guys, I'm Katie from Pegasus Group, and we're the planning consultants to the applicant. So yeah, hopefully Nikki has kind of addressed the employment use, and she's covered that off. There's obviously a balanced decision to be made on that issue, and we think that it was summarised well in the office report. There's an overriding need for housing in Bristol, which the scheme will help to address. In regards to affordable housing, notwithstanding the conclusions of the 2 viability agents, the applicant is accepting that affordable housing is an emotive issue and is therefore willing to offer 3 units as affordable, and that should be an update to your committee reports. The scheme has been amended to address the previous reasons for refusal, and the applicant has proactively engaged with Bristol City Council. The site is unique as it has 3 frontages, and the scheme responds to each, including the terraces on Coronation Road, and by taking advantage of the open aspect onto Asda car park. It also responds to site constraints, including the culverts and improving the turning head at Lucky Lane. As agents, we've been involved with the site for nearly 4 years now, and its redevelopment is long overdue. Should permission be granted, it will allow a scheme to come forward on a brownfield site that can deliver much needed new housing. Thank you.
Thank you. I've then got a written statement from Councillors Dyer and Townsend. Now, members will be aware that neither can be here. I spoke to Tony today, and he's self-isolating before a previously delayed hospital op, so we understand that and clearly give him our best wishes. Councillor Townsend is chairing a public meeting, so if I can purely underscore the fact that clearly you have the elected local members' views before you, and I trust you've read those. The last person to speak is Mark Ashdown from the Tree Forum. Mark.
Thank you, Chair. This is really an 11th hour intervention from us. Initially, we were happy with the BTRS calculation, the tree replacement calculation, and so we weren't going to say anything. But then, at the very late hour, the applicant has submitted biodiversity net gain report, and looking at that, we take issue with that. Hopefully you've read our statement and you've read their report, and you'll see there's a substantial difference. They say, I think, something in the order of a 12% net gain. We say, on our calculation, it's more like 16% net loss. So that's an issue that hasn't really been resolved, and we haven't had an explanation for why there should be such a difference between us. We're also quite surprised that the Council's ecologist hasn't been invited to comment on the biodiversity net gain calculation. Normally, this is expected. The form that is issued by DEFRA, BNG 3.0, there's a 3.1 just came out last week, which is throwing a cat amongst the pigeons, it anticipates that the Council's review will look at the calculation, but there's no comments. So you're slightly at a disadvantage there because you don't see what the ecologist has to say about it. So there are substantial differences between us. The planning officer has indicated that any net gain better than zero, or better than equal to zero or better, not zero, was acceptable. So anything more than zero above is acceptable. You know, as the Environment Act was going to say, when it comes into force next year, will require 10% biodiversity net gain, which the applicant's calculation demonstrates or seems to demonstrate, but we dispute that. If you are minded, however, to grant this application, the officer has put forward a proposed condition which is in line with the BTRS conditions of tree replacement within 5 years of the development of the trees being planted. However, under biodiversity net gain, the requirement for creation of a new urban tree habitat is 27 years. And our argument is that if there's going to be any condition imposed, it ought to be based on a 27-year period, not on a 5-year period. And furthermore, the applicant shouldn't be seeking a credit of 6 years for advanced creation of the habitat. I have no idea where that comes from. Perhaps they think a tree growing in a nursery for 6 years before it's planted is creating habitat, but that's not what BNG requires. So we oppose this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We'll now move to discussion of the planning application at Southville. Can I first of all call upon the officer, Jess Lee, of course. For many of you, you probably know Jess. It's a bit of her last sort of swan song to this committee because she's retiring in June. So certainly we wish her the best for the future, and thank you for your devoted service. Personally, it's a bit sad for me because she's one of the few officers I remembered throughout my 30 years on council. So she probably wasn't very effective at trying to actually keep me on the straight and narrow, but there we are. So, Jess, you have your, despite it being your swan song, you have your usual 5 minutes.
Yeah, be careful what you wish for. I might be back. Yeah, I'd just like to brief introduction to the site, history, constraints, and then I shall concentrate on what I see as the sort of key issues. You will be familiar with the site. Basically, you've got a sort of 1960s office block and then a couple of houses alongside there, and that shows them quite clearly. Site falls within the Bedminster Conservation Area. The Conservation Area Appraisal describes the office building as a negative building and the other two houses being neutral. The trees to the front of the building and the side are subject of a canopy tree preservation order, and alongside to the east of the site, as has been mentioned, you've got the Malago culvert, which runs at a depth of 6.5 metres and basically means that that part of the site can't be developed because of the Environment Agency's requirements for access. Now, the history to the site, there were consents for the redevelopment of the office block only, 2005, 2006. I was that person. That was for mainly residential, but with an office element. The more recent development application was 2019, and that was refused for a number of reasons, which all listed in the report. And I've just for your information, I've included a couple of the, oh, wait a minute, that's Lucky Lane at the back, a couple of visualisations of the scheme. And that originally came in as 70 units and then it was reduced to 46. So that's essentially what was refused previously. Now, the current proposal is essentially for a reworking of the mass. It's 2 fewer units, but as has been described, what has been done this time, they've basically reworked the mass. We have a frontage on Coronation Road. There's a sort of modern interpretation of the terraces also seen along there. On the St John's Lane corner, which you can see there, there's the more a sort of warehousey type effect. And around the back, facing Lucky Lane, which backs onto the houses on Southville Place, you've got some smaller units. And that's the ground floor plan. And you can see how that works. As far as the key issues are concerned, I think the first one I'd like to bring to your attention is the sort of loss of employment issue. And our policy, it's not a designated site as far as industry or warehousing or anything is concerned, but it is an employment use, and therefore policies would require it to be demonstrated that there was no demand for employment purposes. And I think I would concur with the the issues to do with the existing building. It's lack of energy efficiency, lack of accessibility. However, that is the building. It's not to say that the land itself is not valuable for potentially future new employment use. And we'd normally expect that to be demonstrated through a marketing exercise that there is no demand. That hasn't taken place. So what we have a situation now, though, is that it's not specifically designated for use or anything, and the National Planning Policy Framework is quite clear that in circumstances where there are no sort of overriding designations of importance, and they mean by that sort of SSSIs of that nature, or there are no key policy issues within the framework that would mean this should be development should be refused. And basically, the instruction is that developments should be permitted. And I think we have in this situation, I think if that were the only reason for members to feel it ought to be refused, the advice is that it's a tilted balance, and therefore that is not a reason for refusal. Second key issues, which I think has been mentioned by the ward members, and it's the tenure. Now, we'd normally expect on a development of this size, which is 44 units, a percentage of affordable housing. Now, the developers have opted to go through the Viability Assessment route, and they've submitted a fully appraisal that has been independently assessed, and the assessors have concurred with the conclusion that it can't viably support affordable housing. And given that, we did recommend a number, the planning agreement to include a number of clauses to be able to assess the situation through the development of the site to see if that could be reviewed. Now, as you've heard, since the report was written, that they have suggested they're going to provide 3 affordable units, and they will be first homes, so therefore 70% of the market value. And you'll have seen in the amendment sheet that officers are minded to support that situation, but I've got Jim Cliff here with me this evening who will be able to answer any specific questions on that. As far as the mix is concerned, it's a much better mix than it was when it first, the 2019 application. Far fewer single 1-bed units, number of 2-bed, 3-person, 4-person units, but also an additional 3-person, 2 3-person units. Appearance and design, officers, it's been reworked quite significantly, and officers are minded to recommend approval. We feel that with the good quality materials, which are shown in many of the drawings, and detailing, depth of reveal, good quality windows, etc., it could be an attractive addition to that corner, and certainly remove what is a negative building. And I'll just finish briefly on the matter that was raised by Mark Ashdown about the trees. We acknowledge that there is a difference in opinion between the ecologist acting on behalf of the applicant and the tree foreman in respect to the weight to be given to the weight, the urban trees and what they contribute to the biodiversity of the site. All I would say is that it will comply with the Bristol Tree Replacement Standard. There will be a lot of new planting on the site that can be native species, rich, berries, etc. And also, we're looking at bird and bat boxes throughout the scheme. We could, if members were minded to approve, we could introduce a condition that required a sort of a long-term maintenance plan as far as the ecology of the site is concerned. So I think those are the key points I wanted to bring to your attention. We're recommending approval. You'll see the other parts of the section 106 at the end of the report, and we're also seeking delegated authority to agree the conditions with the applicant. They have been drafted, but not shared as such as present. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. Either you must be DMOB happy or I'm being excessively lenient because I think you overspec by 3 minutes, but I won't hold back too much of your pension as punishment. I've got a couple of questions, then we'll move to the floor. Firstly, you mentioned that the applicant hasn't done a 6-monthly, say, marketing of the sites on. Does this put us on an illegal, dodgy ground, or is your view that professionally we're covered?
No, I don't think so, but it is it's something we would normally expect to do on employment sites, expect to see. But as I say, we are in a little bit of a difficult situation at the moment with the lack of a 5-year land supply for residential, which does sort of alter the circumstances somewhat.
My second question was, I must say, the initial red light to me was the lack of affordable housing, like the ward members, though I note the applicant coming forward at this stage with the offer of free dwellings, which equates, I think, to about 9% affordable housing. So that's significant, bearing in mind, I think their development costs, mainly dealing with the culvert, are more substantial and clearly addressed in the viability report. My question was, obviously, you've said you've drafted the conditions. If members are minded to approve, possibly with those conditions or possibly with a few extra, could you actually make a point of actually formally emailing me so I could actually ensure that's what we agreed prior to discharge?
Yep, that's no problem at all.
Fine. Questions, Don?
Thank you. I just have two quick questions. One, on the viability study, of which one is vastly different from the other, and therefore we should assume that maybe the worst case scenario of the deficit of 420k was correct, and therefore no affordable housing could be put in place. How much weight do you think we should put on the report on the basis that they've now come forward and they can put some affordable housing in? So that was the first question.
Yeah, that's a very fair question. Planning viability isn't the same as real viability, and that sounds an odd thing to be saying when we're looking at a real planning application. But planning viability has to be done in accordance with guidance provided by the RICS and government, and that looks at the normal types, or that requires us to put in the normal types of input that would be expected. So, you know, a contingency of about 5 or 6%, professional fees of about 8%, a profit of between 17 and 20%. There are many cases where a developer may have a totally different attitude to risk than that set out in a viability appraisal. So, for example, a landowner may not even be thinking of selling the site, so the land value is irrelevant. They may be looking to build it out themselves. They may be prepared to develop for significantly less than 17 or 18%. They may not need funding. They may have money in their back pocket, so they don't need to borrow. So there's a whole range of reasons why a scheme could be shown to be unviable in planning terms, yet an applicant could say, well, I actually could provide some affordable housing. So it is an odd and a slightly frustrating scenario, which isn't that unusual, whereby we all agree that in planning terms, a development's unable to provide affordable housing, and then within a couple of days of planning committee, an applicant says, oh, well, go on, I'll offer you a little bit. Because you makes you understandably think, well, what was the point of that then? But that's really the rationale behind it. The developer's viability appraisal showed a significantly worse scenario than the appraisal that the council commissioned. And that was primarily because when I looked, they come over my desk initially. When I looked at it, I thought, goodness me, the build costs seem high here. I'm a planner. I'm not a cost consultant or a valuer. But I thought the build costs seem high. So when we got our consultant to look at it, and that's Cushman and Wakefield, we asked specifically for their cost consultancy team to go through it with a fairly fine tooth comb and check on the costs. And the main difference was in costs, and our view was that the cost should be about £1 million less than the applicant's view, but that still didn't bring the scheme back into viability in planning terms.
Thank you. It sounds like all developers should commission that company to look at their costs by the looks of it. Just on the other question was going to be around the conditions that were originally being put in, which was about the council getting a 50-50 share if it was sold over a certain price, and the other 2 points as well. But then the supplement we received today seemed to say that those conditions were pointless. So I'm kind of, because I think in my mind I'm coming to the conclusion that if I'm going to vote to approve this, it probably wouldn't be based on getting rid of the conditions that seemed very sensible in the first place. But now we're saying, well, they might not sell it anyway, and they might not get more than this much money. But surely that's the point of the conditions, that if it does get sold and it does sell for more, that we're kind of protected in our decision.
So there were originally 3 proposed planning obligations relating to viability. One was our very standard one, which says if you don't start within 18 months, so if you don't get on with it, then we look at viability again before you do start. The second was we look at viability at the end when you're ready to occupy to see if the situation's changed. And the third one was one that we put in that said if you sell the land and you sell it for more than the agreed land value, then there's a 50-50 profit share. That type of obligation is an awkward one for applicants. It makes it potentially more difficult for them to get finance for the site. It makes it potentially more difficult for them to sell sites. And what they have asked, they have said, well, we will offer you 3 affordable units, these 3 first homes. But that's a without prejudice offer, which means they could withdraw that offer at any time. And our recommendation is based on the fact that the scheme can't provide affordable housing. So they could withdraw that offer at any time. So they've said, we'll offer these 3, but we'd like you to withdraw the obligation relating to the profit share if we sell the site for more than the land value. So what we did was we looked at the value that those 3 affordable units would generate if it was a cash value. Does that make sense? And that comes out at about £215,000. That's the value to the council of that obligation. So if for the profit share to be a better deal for the council than accepting those units, the applicant would need to sell the land for £430,000 more than the 1.6 million agreed land value. So they'd need to be selling it for 2.1 million, just under. And we took a balanced view. It may be possible for them to do that. It may not. We just don't know. But we took a view that it was potentially more useful for the council to take those 3 units, because we don't know what the site's going to sell. We don't know if the site's going to sell, though we assume from what the applicant said that it will sell. We don't know if it's going to sell for 2.05 million. And if it sells for more than that, well, then the applicant will have, in effect, done slightly better out of the deal. But if it sells for less than that, then we'd have done slightly better out of the deal. Having discussed the issue with the housing enabling team manager, she felt she would rather go down the route of having 3 guaranteed affordable dwellings and would be prepared to lose that obligation because she felt the guaranteed affordable dwellings was potentially a better deal for the council. But the viability reviews further down the line will still happen if the development hasn't started in 18 months, and it will definitely happen when they complete their scheme.
So, Jim or Jess, can we be absolutely sure here and now? So the actual affordable housing conditions we might be minded to approve, they are what?
The affordable housing obligations that we are recommending to you, Councillor Eddy, are that the developer provides 3 first homes, which would be affordable properties, that there is a viability review that if the development hasn't started within 18 months, there is a viability review before the development starts, and in any event, there is a viability review before the development is occupied to see if costs and values have changed such that more affordable housing could be provided.
And can I just clarify, is the start on site requirement, is that the normal planning definition, i.e. it could be build foundations or do some subterranean work?
No, this is a bit of a quirk of planning. So for planning, for Section 106 agreements, commencement usually doesn't include a whole load of stuff, like putting up Harris fencing, demolishing existing buildings, all that sort of stuff. The true definition of planning commencement is any material operation that implements the planning scheme. So in this case, a material operation will be when they start to pull down Castlemead House. And that is and for true planning purposes, that's the point that we'd be looking at. So they need to have started doing that. And there's a reason that we tend to use that, Councillor Eddy, and that is that under the Community Infrastructure Levy, so the SIL regime, SIL kicks in on the true commencement of development. So if they decide to pull down Castlemead House, then they immediately become liable for whatever it is, £300 or £1,000 of the SIL. So they're unlikely to do it unless they know they're going to get on. So the 18 months would be 18 months. They'd have 18 months to start pulling down Castlemead House, in effect.
Fine. Thanks. Tom.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, John. You pinched both my questions there, so I'm going to move on slightly to the sustainable credentials of this plan. It seems that the provision of affordable housing is very low, so I'd like to understand a bit more about how this proposal stacks up in terms of climate emergency. Are we providing 44, 46 units that will need retrofitting in the future, or are these, you know, as part of that viability assessment, we often hear that it's not viable to provide affordable housing because, you know, you either pick sustainability or affordability. So I'd like to know how this one stacks up.
Right. The section in the report looks at that the developers are to link into the heat network, district heat network, which will be there because coming down to serve the Bedminster Green development. So they'll be linking into that, and they've confirmed that, and that'll form part of the Section 106 obligations. The overheating assessment does acknowledge that there might be some overheating up to 2050, 2080 predicted temperatures. But there are various measures also recommended that will help address that. They're looking at, the sustainability statement with it talks about materials having lower environmental impact with preference for recycle, reclaim content, and also high levels of insulation. And they've confirmed that there's information from OpenReach that it'll be served by superfast broadband. So I think we're particularly with the obligation to link into the district heat network, that certainly it is a very positive thing. And they're also looking, I believe, at solar panels on the roof as well.
Tom, you are happy, or at least do you accept those responses?
Yeah, what was the residual carbon reduction? Because I know we've got an obligation at the moment for 20% reduction, but obviously going forward, we presumably need that to be 100%. How does it stack up for that?
It complies with that. I haven't got the exact data because I can't pull up the, the document as well as have that on, I'm afraid. But no, it does certainly comply with the 20%. And at the moment, that's what the policy requirement is. And we recognise that might change, and we'd always encourage best practice. But it is policy compliant at the moment.
Philippa.
Thank you, Richard. I've got a couple of questions. The first is about the affordable houses or homes. So would these be the one-bed flats, the three-bed flats?
If Jess, could you just go back to your ground floor plan for me? Because that will show them. Stop. Right, it is the units on the right-hand side as you look at the plan. I think I'm not sure if they're, let me think, it's units 11, 12 and 13. So the ones fronting on the corner of St John's Lane and Lucky Lane, it's those three units there. One of them's one bed. From this plan, it's not obvious to see. I think there's one bed and I think they're all one beds by the looks of things. So it's the three on the right-hand side, and I think they're all one-bed units.
So in terms, so is this right then? So in terms of numbers of units, it's 7% affordable, but in terms of number of occupants, it would be significantly less than that.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I mean, our policy is based on number of units.
Okay.
And the only other thing I would say is we're not, as an officer, I can't recommend to you that we should be after more units or different units, because what I'm recommending to you is that the viability advice that we've got is that in planning terms, the scheme can't provide any affordable housing. So the fact that some has been offered, yeah, I'd hardly say it's a bonus, but it's something that's been offered, but we're not in a strong position to say, no, we want bigger or better.
Okay.
Gary?
And I think I can add as well, because they're being offered as first homes, so discounted market product, there is a limit to the type of unit that can be brought forward as first homes, because they have to be affordable within that definition. So I think that probably leads this to those units rather than larger units.
Thank you. Then I had another question. The east-facing elevation picture, is the church and the building, are they to scale?
I'm not sure that they are.
I don't. It looks like honest. Sort of, I don't know, York Minster or something.
When I copied that onto the screen, exactly the same thought crossed my mind.
Yeah.
But I think our officers in the design team are, with the reworking of the mass, are happy now that the impact on what is the Grade 2 listed church tower, St Paul's on Coronation Road, will remain largely visible from key vantage points. I think it's the previous scheme that was refused because of the way it was massed had a more intrusive impact.
Okay. Thank you. And my other quick question is about have they got the maximum number of solar panels that they are allowed? Do we know?
Well, there isn't really a maximum, but what they'll be looking to do, it'll need to be sufficient to comply with the policy requirement of an additional 20% saving. Okay. So we would recommend a condition that required full details of those solar panels, because obviously we need to know that they're facing the right way and they're actually going to provide what they say they're going to provide.
Thank you.
P.
No, my question was just about the solar panels, because you said they were looking at them, and I just wanted a bit of clarity, so that's helpful, thank you.
They are actually shown on the roof plan that's been submitted.
The phrase looking at them made suspect there could be some shift in that. That's all. Anyway, thank you, Jess.
Paul?
Thanks, Richard. While we've got all the experts here on viability assessments, I'd just like to ask a couple of quick technical questions. In terms of independent assessment, who pays for that? Is that the same company that pays for the viability assessment?
We pay for it, but what we do, so we commission, we have 4 viability consultants on our panel, in fact, and we pick the one that we think is most appropriate to look at any given scheme that comes in. So we choose the consultant and we commission them and we pay for them. But in doing that, we say to the applicant, we're having to incur costs here in looking at this. We would like you to cover our costs, please. And we seek an undertaking from the applicant to cover our costs. And then when the viability process is finished, our consultant invoices us, we pay our consultant, and then we seek to reimburse our costs from the applicant. That way, we've always done it that way because it doesn't seem right somehow that the applicant would be paying directly our consultant, and it would leave us open to accusations of, exactly the sort of thing that people could say, well, actually, it's the applicant's paying both sets of consultants, so what do you expect the outcome's going to be? So no, we commission. We don't ask the applicant if they're happy with our costs. We say, this is what it is, it's going to cost X £1,000, and we ask them to cover our costs once we've paid our consultant out of our budget. So it's cost neutral to us, in effect.
Thank you. No, that's very helpful. And I'm just wondering on a general thing, is it often that viability assessments come back and say, no, actually there should be more affordable housing?
Yeah. We don't actually get that many viability. We get far fewer viability assessments these days than we used to. But it's certainly not unusual for our consultant to come back and say, that there should be more. And we've had some fairly extreme scenarios. So site down in South Bristol on Parkview Car Park down in Whitchurch, the applicant was offering no affordable housing, and our consultant said, no, this can provide the full 30%. And we took it to committee and said, we think this can provide 30%. And, you approved it on that basis, and the applicant lumped it, in effect. They huffed and puffed, but they've gone with it. So you can get quite extreme differences because people do try it on sometimes. But there's no denying that it is quite challenging, particularly on city centre, tightly constrained sites. Viability is fairly challenging. But it's not unusual that we would come up with a higher percentage than the applicant would originally offer.
Thanks. Yeah, I can see obviously that sort of shows that the independent assessment is generally independent, which is good. I was more wondering about the initial viability assessment. Do they often, if an applicant says, "Oh, I can't afford it," do they make that decision after they have received their original viability assessment?
So there might be a slight misunderstanding here. Then. So the applicant will commission the applicant if they feel that they're not going to be able to provide policy compliant affordable housing, they will, as part of their planning application submission, commission a viability appraisal for themselves by a consultant, and they will submit that to us and say, here's our planning application, we can't provide 30%, we've asked X consultant to look at it, and they say we can provide 0%, 10%, what have you. We would then get our own consultant to assess whether they would agree with the inputs that the applicant has put into their viability. So that's how that works. The applicant has almost commissioned, if they don't feel they can afford the full policy compliant level of affordable housing, they've commissioned their consultant and come up with what they can offer at the point that the application is submitted. And that's one of the reasons that we introduced the fast track process, where in the city centre, if people were offering 20%, we would take it as read.
That's very clear, thank you.
Tom.
Thank you. Continuing down the viability assessment route, I noticed that compared to the previous application, this one has a net increase of 3 units that can accommodate 3 or more people. So I just wondered if the viability assessment process looked at the viability of providing a mix, including more units for families and 3 or more people.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. The answer is no, and the answer is the reason the answer is no is because what I am generally tasked to do when we get viability appraisals in, and what the planning officers are required to do, is assess the scheme as submitted. So if the applicant wants to put in, 50 small one-bed units, then we'll assess it on that basis. If that's unacceptable in planning terms because of other non-viable viability reasons, then it'll fail on that basis. But we would just look to assess the viability of what's been submitted. If what's been submitted changes during the course of determining the application, so if Jess and her colleagues say this needs a storey taken off, or we need more 2-bed units and fewer 1-bed units and what have you, then there are occasions where viability is resubmitted to take account of the changing circumstances. And then we will look at it again on that basis. And there have been cases where we've gone through the whole process 2 or 3 times. But no, our starting point is we assess what's been submitted by the applicant.
Thank you. That sort of answers my second question, which was about the viability of providing a mixed-use development, as I've noted that previous applications had included some office space downstairs. Is there any discussion that's been had with the applicant about providing a mixed-use space? Previously in this committee, we had to approve Castle Park.
I think they've been very clear in the submission that they don't wish to do so. So we haven't discussed that. I mean, the earlier consents are 17 years old. So we are going back a little bit. But I say tellingly, possibly, those consents were never implemented.
Could I just chip in? So what we do find as well on a number of schemes over the years, and I'm digressing a little bit, but we find that we've had scenarios where we've said we want some ground floor or some active ground floor usage, and you get two or three relatively small office units on the ground floor, and lo and behold, what happens is the scheme gets built, the units get marketed, nobody wants them, and an application comes in to convert them to housing. So it's not unusual, is it, that you get this scenario where we ask for a little bit of commercial on the ground floor, and it then becomes, the thing's built and actually there's not really any demand for it, so the applicant comes in to convert it to housing anyway. I'm not saying that's a good reason for not asking for an active ground floor usage, but it's a reality that we see all too frequently on those sort of sites.
Ed.
I've got three questions. First is viability again. On the amendment sheet, the words without prejudice are there, and you talked about that very briefly, that it's without prejudice. I just want to be clear. If we condition that there will be these 3 units, is that then not without prejudice, with prejudice, as it were? Is that a condition? Because I was struggling to understand which bit of this kind of dominoes is with and without prejudice.
The applicant's main concern was that they were prepared to offer those 3 units, but in return for offering those 3 units, I suppose a quid pro quo, they would like that initial obligation about the profit share on the land sale removed. So I think, if we were to accept those 3 units and remove the obligation on the profit share, then I think that without prejudice offer would become a formal offer. And I'm looking in the direction of the planning consultant.
And
yeah, that's correct. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, that's useful to know because that gives us a bit more certainty. If the site is then subsequently sold, are we likely to go through this whole thing again? Is there a risk that we just find that actually the new people say, well, look, there's 2 viability assessments here that say, no, it's not viable at all. They were obviously just trying to squeak it through them and now going back on that.
We can't control what happens. If the site is sold, if the site's sold and somebody wants to implement the scheme that's got planning permission, then we won't tolerate any further viability on it. If the site's sold and somebody puts in a new application for a different scheme, then we're duty bound to assess that application on the basis of what's been put in front of us.
The second one was about the long-term biodiversity net gain plan. And I think I heard Jess, say that we could condition that. And are we clear and have we done any work in order that we can do that today, or will we have to defer a decision in order to enter into negotiations about that?
Well, I think we could certainly recommend a condition, include a condition that, let's say, required a sort of like ecological management plan of the site with short, medium and long-term aims included. I think to put a specific requirement to cover 27 years, given where we are without the Environment Act, without the regulations approved, I think the practicality of that would be possibly stretching things a little. But we can certainly, the actual open part of the site and the trees, it's not that big. But as I said, that would be my recommendation. We would have a standard sort of landscaping condition that required things to be replanted within 5 years, etc., etc. But as I say, we can introduce a management plan requirement as well.
So we could move a motion to do this with delegated authority for that. I'm very mindful of the fact this is incredibly close to New Cut, which has actually got quite a rich biodiversity. We've recently seen otters and other wonderful kind of indicator species that indicate that it's getting very positive, and I'd like that every possible attempt to make sure that that is enhanced.
Yeah.
Then the last one was, I may have missed it in the report, but SIL, I didn't see any mention of SIL, and presumably there's a fairly healthy allocation coming through this. I think I heard a number mentioned, but I don't remember seeing it in the actual report.
I was just going to blame Jess for not putting that in, but she's beaten me to it and said her fault. The SIL, I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what it is, but it's somewhere around £300,000. I think it's a little bit less than that, but it's in that ballpark figure.
Can I suggest we move to the debate? I'll have to go first. for me, actually, this site is very close to my heart, actually, because over 30 years ago, I was driving just before John Bercow, who was then the PPC for Bristol sectors. Now, of course, he's crossed the floor after a career as Speaker in Parliament. And he famously, and he was one of the worst drivers in history, in my view, managed to drive into the back of my car. So you could say that car crash started the car crash, which was his political career. More seriously, as befits this application, to me, this issue really rests on two major issues. Firstly, the loss of employment space. Whilst I am loath normally to see this go, certainly without an applicant's trawl of the market for a site, I do understand the arguments that we're talking of a 50-plus-year-old building which is not fit for purpose in today's work environment, and even if it could be used by some form of companies, it wouldn't be, as, for example, Tom's made reference, environmentally more appropriate as the applicant is proposing. So I believe the argument has been well made there, that isn't a reason for actually rejecting this scheme. The other issue is harder, in my view. It's the original lack of affordable housing, which all of us on this committee bemoan and fight against. I am pleased the applicants came forward with the offer of 3 units, which I think is a considerable progress. And I understand the rationale for the higher costs on site, as I understand it, though I regret it's not higher, which is a view I think we all share. My concern is that if it's appropriately conditioned, as the officers have said, were we minded to turn this down, I'm afraid I suspect we would lose at the planning inspector level. Possibly it would cost awarded against us. So is it worthwhile actually having more housing, including affordable housing in Southville, or is it not? So on that basis, I believe I'm minded to approve this with a bit of a heavy heart, but certainly adding what Jim and Jess have mentioned, and it's equally keen on, a new condition requiring an ecological management plan to safeguard the sorts of things that Ed is worried about. That's my view. Andrew.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, a few things have disappointed me about this application. Obviously, I think with everyone else, we're very disappointed that the viability assessment showed originally that there was no scope for affordable housing. So, you know, that did generate quite a lot of negative publicity the last couple of days. And I'm pleased that the applicants put forward the possibility of having 3 affordable units. So that's obviously better than nothing. So I think that is to be commended. Also disappointed that a proper marketing exercise wasn't undertaken to assess employment uses, but I accept the fact that there are other more suitable spaces nearby. And also a comment that Councillor Dyer and Councillor Townsend made, the 2 local ward councillors, that they felt they weren't properly engaged in the process, and I think that's a real shame, and I would encourage all developers to engage with the local councillors. They know the area best of all and can often give good advice and you know, hopefully get a more acceptable scheme coming forward. But having said all that, I think the key issues have been dealt with, and so for that reason I won't be opposing this. I will be supporting it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm really troubled with the affordable housing. the fact that there was 20% originally planned and 3 have been thrown in at the last minute. However, they are only if we remove the profit share condition. So, as has been said, it is a quid pro quo. So I'm really, really not happy with it. We've got such a housing crisis in Bristol that I'm minded to refuse.
Thank you, Chair. This is like an awful lot of other planning debates. Two-handed. On the one hand, we have this, and on the other hand, we have that. I'm disappointed at the loss of employment land because it's very sustainable in terms of the journey to work, because Southville's quite a high density populated area, so people wouldn't necessarily have very far to journey to their place of employment. So I think that's an opportunity lost there, which is disappointing. Affordable housing. We need housing. We need affordable housing. We need to find ways of bringing affordable housing forward. I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm going to vote to refuse this on the basis of nothing like enough affordable housing.
I think we all feel quite uneasy about this one on a number of levels. We're slightly uneasy about the affordable housing element, we're uneasy about the loss of employment, we're also uneasy about some of the ecological aspects of it. But I think what we are stuck with is some legislation which currently doesn't allow us to refuse it. From what the Environment Act did not come into force for another year. That might have changed things. The profit levels, as Jim has spelt out to us, which developers are allowed to take on, are, to some people's minds, excessive. I may not like it, but that looks like it's the law. Those levels of profit which they're allowed to make are legal, and that legally allows them, much as we may dislike it, to build with a low number of affordable housing. So I'm in the heavy heart category on this one, I'm afraid. I think we have to vote for it, but I do feel uneasy, and I think we are let down by the legislation behind this, because it's just not there to support us with what we need for this city.
Thank you. Gary?
Yes, Chair, I think you want me to just talk about prospects at appeal if we refused on viability of affordable housing, really. And yeah, we are kind of stuck with both national and local policy. The local policy, which has had to comply with national policy at the time, would require, in this case, 30%, but the key part of the policy is subject to viability. And we've gone through as extensive a viability process as we're allowed to under the current regulations, really. And the national policy, whilst it has improved the situation in terms of, having regard to existing land value rather than, hope value, it still puts us in a position where, our hands are tied really in terms of what we can negotiate. So I think, at an appeal, the planning inspector would go through the same process and I think would come to the same conclusion. And I have to say, if the 3 first homes were still on the table, I think a government planning inspector would give that a lot of weight, really. So, yeah, I think officers make these kind of recommendations also with a heavy heart. We wish the policy was different. It's negotiation site by site with our sort of hands tied behind our back, really. This is why I think we're all interested to see what the plans are for potentially a infrastructure levy that might deliver more affordable housing than this piecemeal approach. But unfortunately, it's the piecemeal approach that we're with, really. So we'd just reinforce that we think the recommendation is the right one, and that a refusal on lack of affordable housing unfortunately wouldn't be likely to be successful at appeal.
John?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I was completely cold to this application when I first saw it, until the supplement came in and it kind of raised more questions. And I want to thank the council for challenging the viability study, which is why we'd made the point at a previous meeting that we want pubs planning to close to have viability studies challenged as well. So, I mean, that's a positive. I think, you know, from the developer's point of view, it's very frustrating as a councillor sitting here to see that we say it's this number and somebody says it's a number over £1 million out, and then to say you can't do affordable housing and all of a sudden you pop up with a few, along with an ultimatum. But ultimately, I feel we have to approve it. And I think just on another note, and I know affordable housing is a major thing, and that was why I was completely cold to this, is that one of the only ways you do reduce home prices and rental prices across Bristol is by increasing supply. It's a supply and demand thing, and ultimately this increases supply by a bit. And on the basis that if it was challenged, it would be approved, I'll be voting for it.
Tom.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the officer for the report. This application for me still feels like a bit of a slap in the face, not only because of the really poor affordable housing commitment, but as the councillors have said, there's been no engagement with them, poor engagement with the community. It's really poor ambition on our climate commitments and ecology for the site. And the mix of units to me doesn't contribute to a balanced community, as well as Steve mentioned about the crucial loss of employment space in a sustainable location. So I can't vote for this.
Ed?
The word of the evening is disappointing. I think this is disappointing on so many fronts. Sustainability, bare minimum. Design, not doing damage, but hardly enhancing a conservation area. The future livability and the mix of tenure, improved, but still not optimum. Loss of employment space, disappointing. The discrepancy with the biodiversity net gain assessments, very disappointing, and hopefully we'll be able to condition something there. Very disappointing engagement. And most of all, very disappointing on the affordable housing. However, I'm mindful of the fact that construction inflation is going quite high at the moment, and I'm very nervous of the fact that if we were to turn this down, then we would find that any affordable housing would become even less viable. And so I'm going with a very heavy heart, and disappointment being the word of the evening, I'm going to be supporting this.
Andrew.
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry, if I could just quickly add that I'm also concerned about the confusion over the biodiversity net gain, and I would also support conditioning an ecological maintenance plan as part of the approval.
Thank you. Can I suggest we now move to the debate? I think we've had the vote. I don't know whether it concerns Ed Plowden more than me, but he seemed to almost be speaking for me. So that must trouble you, Ed, and it troubles me too. Anyway, can I propose the officer's recommendation, admittedly with a bit of a heavy heart, to approve with the conditions we agree, including an ecological management plan, Jess? We do a name vote, so can I remind you it's to approve, against, or against, or to abstain? John?
Approve.
Andrew?
Approve.
Tom?
Against.
Fee?
Approve.
Ed?
Approve.
Steve? Philippa?
Against.
And also Paul?
Against.
And I'll vote to approve. So I believe that's narrowly approved. Am I right? Yeah. So I formally refer that's been approved. So that's the decision of this committee. May I thank Jess and Jim as well, of course, and particularly wish you bon voyage to sail off into the sunset. And formally mention our next meeting, which is the AGM, is on the 8th of June at 2 p.m, not AM. And I formally close the meeting.